Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewitz, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyse and Adapt, where I see if a video game would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop, as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay, like Dungeons & Dragons, and finally, as a Larp. Today we're taking a look at one of my most favorite games of all time, Mount and Blade Warband, and also my most played game according to Steam. So what is Mount and Blade Warband, and why is it one of my top games of all time? Well, on the surface it's because I'm a big fan of swords, armor, shields, and wearing them. In fact, this game is part of the reason why I'm so interested in LARP in the first place. In the end, it's hard to put into words why I like it so much, but I guess it's the little things that you can do in it that really get to me. To begin with, you start the game crafting your backstory, something that actually determines your starting stats and equipment. You're then dropped into a big sandbox world of Calradia, where you then become a bandit, a noble lord, or a humble merchant. From there, you can get into large-scale battles as an individual with an army of soldiers you've recruited and trained yourself. You can also get involved in sieges in the walls of a castle, recruit companions who can level up, or involve yourself in courtly intrigue, and much, much more. To make a long story short, it's a medieval sandbox game. As much as I enjoy the mods, I seem to find myself going back to the base game, with the only change being the battle size expansion to allow more units on field at any given time. But I'm not just here to gush about how much I love this game, I'm here to analyze and adapt it. For the sake of ease, we're only looking at adapting the single player aspect, aka the aspect that makes you feel like a god if you play it long enough. For those of you who guess I'm terrible at the multiplayer part, well, you're 100% correct. So let's start analyzing and adapting with Tabletop. For a one-to-one adaptation of the game to work, there would have to be a lot of moving parts. To begin with, we would have to have every single lord moving on the overworld map. Then you'd have to have the villages, the bandits, and everything else in between. All in all, this is a headache to track. If we only kept the lords and ignored all other types of groups on the map, however, we'd still have dozens upon dozens of miniatures to manage, where the player would only be able to control one at a time. Ignoring those issues, the game luckily does simplify things to some degree by representing an entire army or a group of people with a single unit, until battle ensues, something that we can bring over to the tabletop version as well. If we were to adapt the game, I would cut down on how many lords there would be and the amount of territories available as well, rolling the various villages and castles into singular locations. The player could still raid villages and besiege castles, but instead of approaching them individually, they would instead approach the territory as a whole and be given a list of choices with different effects once in said territory. Each lord on the overworld map would have a little number attached to it, which would correspond to a card, detailing their names, stats, and even their relationship points. Something that would move up or down on an inbuilt slider or just use colored tokens. Said cards could also come with more cards, representing loot or army compositions. The figurine would also have a little colored pip that could be swapped out for other colors to represent faction affiliation. Manhunters, bandits, etc. wouldn't need these pips, but the villages and other locations would. In fact, if we're talking about locations, they could just be printed flat on the board itself with little flags to represent who they belong to. Maybe even have a tiny little plastic destroyed hut to represent the village being pillaged as well. Now that I think about it, locations would also have cards, but keeping track of what they do or don't sell would be difficult, never mind actually doing that for every location. We could simplify it by giving each location a prosperity rating that could go up or down depending on the situation. Depending on that rating, the player would then draw an amount of cards to represent what the shop has in stock. This comes with 2 issues, which I'll explain with the following example. Let's say the player enters the city of Providence and draws from the deck some bread and butter resources. The player, for whatever reason, decides to leave without buying anything, but later changes their mind and comes back, only for them to redraw and possibly get a different set of cards. This could even be abused by having the player leave and come back constantly until they can get what they want. The alternate way of doing this is to ensure Providence has the same cards when they come back, but if we do it this way, we'd have to do it for every location they visit, making it more difficult and cumbersome to manage. Having to keep track of 3 places of their stock might be manageable, but there are dozens upon dozens of these places scattered throughout the map. Then you'd have the items themselves. Swords and trade goods are pretty straightforward on how they'd be handled, but food is another matter. Besides tracking how much your army would consume each day, you'd also have to keep track of how old the food is, since the base game has some of them go bad over time. Then you'd have to track how much morale each food gives, how much morale you'd get for certain events, and how many of your men would desert you in what conditions. All of these things would normally be tracked by the video game itself, but in a board game setting, players would have to take responsibility, making this less of a game and more of a glorified budget sheet that needs to be balanced and maintained. To keep the fun of the game intact, we'd have to simplify just about everything. Each location could come with 3 sets of stats: poor, normal, and rich, kept tracked by the little tokens on the board. Each set of stats would determine what goods would be available to buy at the start of every turn, restocking what it does, with richer stats giving wider selections of goods. Depending on what is or isn't available, certain goods could sell more or less at certain locations, so keeping a specific place poor might actually be a good idea. As a side note, inventory would be tracked using cards, and with a higher inventory skill, players would be able to hold more cards at any one time. Besides buying and selling, the owner of the location would also gain income based on said prosperity. If things get too much for a single person, we could always have multiple people fighting each other as leaders of their respective factions. Something like combat would have to be changed though if we go this route. If it were just 2 people fighting each other, we could have the players go to a separate battle map where they would move their units around and fight, something similar to 40k or even chess. However, once we have a 3rd player, they'd have to sit on the sidelines and watch until everything is done, unless said player is allowed to take control of certain units. However, that comes with its own issues in that the 3rd player might not have said units perform the best moves in order to hurt the player in which said unit is supposed to be aligned with. For example, if another player's archers have been giving me grief and I have sudden control of them, I could then run them into suicidal situations and get rid of them that way. We could also have the players be simplified so that matches between 2 players are short enough that the other players wouldn't get too bored with it. In that regard, we could just use the auto-resolve system from the video game with some tweaking. Certain locations will give bonus modifiers or negatives to certain kinds of units based on the terrain. A cavalry charge on the open plains would be devastating but almost useless in the cramped confines of a city, for example. Besides terrain and troop types, we'd also have the character's tactic skill influence things along with their personal equipment and a dice roll or 2 to account for variance and randomness in battle. Besides adding up the numbers and determining casualties and loot, there wouldn't be much to this method of doing things. While the solution does take away the spectacle of large-scale battles, it's something the video game actually supports, so there is precedent. Even if the auto-resolve system lets shoeless looters kill my fully trained armored knights. I'm not bitter about that. I'm not bitter about it at all. So to recap, the overworld map would physically be flat with locations printed on said map. They'd also have prosperity tokens to keep track of how wealthy they are. Adding on to that idea, we could have different thresholds for castles and towns. Where a village would need 3 tokens to be considered rich, a town would need 6 or maybe 9. This is to ensure that when they lose prosperity tokens due to raids or other events, they can withstand them better than less defended locations. If that becomes too much to keep track of, we could always go with my earlier idea of rolling villages and towns into one singular territory. In that case, raiding the prosperity of one aspect would affect the area's wealth as a whole. Besides raiding, each player could also spend gold or dinars to recruit units, which would battle and capture territory with them. As for end goals, the game can end in 2 different ways. We could have the obvious victory condition of one player owning every territory, or at least a majority of them. The second option would have to work off a points-based system that would be tallied after a certain amount of rounds, and this would ensure games would not go on forever. Remember what I said about those prosperity points for each location? Said victory condition could be based on that. Attacking and raiding your enemy villages could reduce those points, while protecting your own or capturing them would raise your own. As many mechanics as this adaptation keeps, I feel that it sacrifices the most important experience of growth in that you already start as rulers in this board game. In fact, you're playing less of an individual and more of a faction in this case. That said, I have high hopes for the next medium in that regard. On the surface, Mount and Blade can be adapted to any non-magical system where you only fight human enemies. In terms of spirit, we would just then add lords, castles, and call it a day. If we wanted to make a proper one-to-one adaptation, we'd have to go over the stats, skills, and how they work for the characters, and for the most part, said skills are pretty straightforward, being literal stat boosts. Iron Flesh, for example, gives the player additional hit points. Power Strike does extra damage, you get the idea. Other skills such as looter, training, and tactics, while cumbersome or odd to play out on tabletops, can still be done. Looter, for example, would allow the player to modify the loot table and be the most simple of the 3 skills to use. Training would make the NPC followers who are lower level than you gain experience points quicker, making it straightforward but cumbersome as you'd have to keep track of all of their experience points. This also applies to NPCs who have the skill, who would then give experience points to the lower level NPCs. Point is, is a lot of work involved, but it can still be done. The tactic skill is only ever used during auto-resolve events, or events in which the player doesn't directly intervene, like leaving behind men to retreat. While odd from a tabletop game perspective, this can still be used in that fashion. What really makes me scratch my head as a skill is the skill inventory management. Now don't get me wrong, in a video game it's fine. When you have it, the skill allows you and your army to hold more and more items, which on the surface makes sense. However, things begin to break down when you start reading into it. At its base level, without any modifications, the player can carry around 30 slots worth of items. Each slot can hold 50 units of fresh beef, weighing 20 units each. Now in the game, when we slaughter cattle, we fill up 2 inventory slots for a total of 100 units of fresh beef and 40 weight units. A quick Google search tells us that we can get up to 440 pounds of beef from each cow. Discounting the difference in slaughter/butchering methods in the game's universe and ours, we can say that one weight unit in Warband is roughly 10 pounds. In other words, a player character on their own, even without a horse, can carry 200 pounds of weight per inventory slot they possess. Since they have 30 slots to begin with, that becomes 6,000 pounds. For metric users like myself, that's over 2,700 kilograms, over 2 tons. Even if cows in the Warband universe were smaller, or, the butchers not being that efficient, that's still a lot of weight for a single person to carry around. Ignoring the character's superhuman feats of strength, if the average player in an average non-magical medieval world was given the task of moving a literal ton of beef from one village to another, most would respond by using wagons. How does one move the wagons? With horses, of course, or people in a pinch. In Warband, however, adding people doesn't let you carry more stuff, and adding horses actually makes you carry less of it, since each horse takes up an inventory slot. Instead, horses being kept in the inventory just lets you and your army move more quickly across the overworld map. However, people still can't carry the beef, no matter how many soldiers you have. This is addressed beautifully in the sequel of Bannerlord, but I'm not talking about Bannerlord right now, I'm talking about Warband. Each slot doesn't just allow the player to hold over 200 pounds of beef either, it also lets them hold a dagger, sword, or other weapon. A random arming sword is 1.8 weight units, and if they're using the formula above, this means it's about 18 pounds. 9 if we're assuming that it's supposed to be lighter. Wikipedia, and yes, I'm using Wikipedia, says an arming sword is 2.4 pounds, which either means my maths is way off, or the butchers who slaughter the cows are really inefficient. Now, this weight thing wouldn't be much of a problem if you could have multiple arming swords and daggers in the same slot, but you can't. You can either choose between 200 pounds of beef or 2 pounds of sword. Ignoring all the specific numbers of how much something should cost, this still means I can carry 30 arming swords, weighing a total of 45 Warband weight units, or 30 stacks of fresh beef, weighing a total of 600 weight units. Even if the weight units were supposed to be abstract, that's still too much for me to think about. Hell, we can even go smaller with knives. Now, it's one thing to stop a player from mixing up the right ingredients to make gunpowder in a medieval setting, but it's another to stop a player from boxing up hundreds of knives and placing it on a wagon. But enough about inventory space, that's not important to Warband. And as annoying as it is for me to think about, I don't think anyone remembers the game for the inventory skill, and no one would say it's integral to the experience. Outside a few weirdos, that is. But hey, if that's your thing, then go for it. I'm not here to judge. Moving on to the actual gameplay for the group. In the video game, the players run around the world, recruiting peasants to train into proper soldiers. Sometimes they'll rescue prisoners, adding them to their army, and other times they'll just go to bars and get mercenaries and companions that way. This is where the tabletop part literally begins. In terms of how the game would handle large-scale battles, we could do something similar to the Legend of the Five Rings game, in that players would choose if they're fighting in the front lines, in reserves, or anywhere in between. I won't go into too much detail on how it works, but depending on how the battle goes and the player positions, they could be hurt and be placed in special combat encounters that'll let them go for the enemy leader, take the high ground, or defend an exposed flank. For characters making a party, it'd be simple. In a story as old as the first dice roll, we'll have the tabletop version of Warband begin in a tavern. Each player can make their own characters, and just like the video game, have the companions introduce themselves and their backstories to the leading character. Said leading character can be one of the players, but can just as easily be the GM as well. That might seem like it'd be open to abuse as DMPC, but having the GM play a character in a direct leadership role isn't unheard of. Dark Heresy, for example, has them play as the Inquisitor who gives the player their assignments. Something similar could happen here. Honestly, there's nothing wrong with being a follower. After all, Jeremus is a follower and he's amazing. That said, even though it's perfectly in-universe as a premise, it doesn't follow the spirit of the video game. Players are supposed to be able to do their own thing and be independent, and while you can certainly do that in a tabletop RPG, you're discouraged, of course, from splitting the party. Point is, by its very nature, it'd be very easy to adapt an RPG into the world of Mount and Blade Warband, but if you want the same independent experience, you need a medium that doesn't ask everyone to stick together. In that regard, maybe our next analysis will do better. Unless we use toy horses and the like, mounted combat is simply out. As nice as a real horse can be, they're too expensive, and even then, even if we're all filthy rich, it'd be too much effort training them not to freak out when we hit them with swords. And even then, even if we train them not to freak out from being hit with swords, they'd still wouldn't be able to count their own hit points when hit, something very important in Warband, because if you hit a horse enough in that game, they will fall over and die. So let's ignore that issue and focus on a different one that we can address. A big thing in the video game is momentum. A sword swing that hits someone backing away from it will deal less damage than someone literally who runs into the sword. In Larp, trying to measure momentum and force would be very subjective. If someone small strikes someone large, there's no guarantee they'll feel it or consider it a proper hit, especially if they're being hit in a particularly padded part of their armor from behind. That's part of the parcel when it comes to Larp though, and for the most part, people find ways around it. Trying to determine how much damage someone does based on how much force there is, however, throws that into disarray as it turns things subjective. My strong hit might be considered average for some, while some people's weaker hits could be considered strong. Then you've got the cheaters who could come around and say, yeah, those are all weak, I don't take much damage from any of them. Now granted, if we don't use this system, it wouldn't stop them from cheating in the first place, but at least it gives them less of a window to try. Then of course, even if no one actually cheats, that doesn't stop people from accusing others of doing just that. Even in an established Larp system, I've seen two perfectly good honest players argue whether one person had actually been struck or not, with one saying they felt resistance against their sword, while the other person said they didn't feel anything at all. In terms of game design, you want to have the numbers in Larp as low as possible. Now I don't mean we need to have everyone running around with one hit point, I just mean people shouldn't do constant equations when running around and dodging arrows at the same time. In that regard, trying to determine if a sword strike does 9 damage or 27 to your 90 hit points will have to be taken right out or simplified. Why does a sword have to do 9 damage to a 90 health target when you can have them do 1 damage to a 9 health target, for example? Something like the athletic skill would have to be removed altogether. If you can't run very well but have every point in the skill, it just wouldn't make much sense. People should be able to run as fast as they do in real life. Another issue is the shield skill, which in the video game increases the hitbox and toughness of your shield. That's not something we can really replicate in real life in terms of hitboxes. Now there are 3 ways to handle this off the top of my head. The first is to get rid of the skill. The second is to have certain shield sizes locked behind the skill's level. Flavor it as the person not being trained well enough to use said shield, so someone with a low level in the skill can only have something small. The third option is to give shield HP values and give them more as they level up. The first option from a game designer point of view I range from neutral to somewhat but not enthusiastically liking as a solution. As someone who is trying to adapt Mount and Blade Warband though, I'll try to keep this as a last resort. The second option, while neat from a certain viewpoint, I can see rather being annoying from a practical one. Now assuming this becomes a real rule, it forces players coming in from other LARPs with pre-existing equipment not able to use said equipment. Then you have the newbies who don't have any equipment and they're trying to figure out what to buy. Every time they level up, they'd probably feel compelled to buy bigger and bigger shields, and LARP is a expensive enough hobby as is. There's no reason to exacerbate the issue. The third option of giving shields hit points works well enough on paper, but in practice this means you have to keep track of not just your own hit points, but also the shield itself. Remember what I said about keeping numbers simple in LARP? Well, that advice would apply here as well. In other words, the first option is the most practical, even if it's the most boring. So the immediate combat stats and skills would have to be simplified to work, but otherwise I think with enough people we could have said combat be adapted well enough into the world of Mount and Blade, at least in spirit. Speaking of spirits and ghosts, what do we do about death? The answer? Nothing. Okay, maybe not nothing, but hear me out. When your troops get reduced to 0 hit points in Mount and Blade Warband, they're killed or sometimes knocked out to be healed if their side is victorious, or to be captured as a prisoner if not. Lords, companions, and the main character, however, are never at risk of dying, and are instead always knocked out. I can think of 3 options that would stick to the mechanics of the game. The first would be to have everyone getting knocked out, nobody dying. This would likely lead to a very combat-heavy game, where there's no real consequence to losing a fight beyond money. In the video game, I'd be able to loot their sword or helmet sometimes, but in real life, we can't really do that. Most people don't like giving up a piece of equipment that's cost them literally hundreds of dollars. The second option involves everyone having the same potential to die, with a modifier based on either your medical skills or allies. However, you could keep the character sheet and come back into the play as a new but identical character with a different name and mustache. Only the lords and like would not die upon reaching 0 hit points. When respawning, the new character might lose their levels and need to be ranked up and promoted by their lords again. This second option has the issue of creating cliques, or at least the potential. It's already a concern in LARPs, and this mechanic would only encourage it, possibly making a toxic, elitist environment. Players who are lords might have the power go to their heads, having a literal mechanical reason why they're better than everyone else. It's one thing to be a lord in any other game, but being a lord and be unkillable is another. The third option would have the lords be played by the organizers themselves. They wouldn't personally get involved in combat and would represent them as trying to auto-resolve every battle. They could, of course, still be captured. While this could still create cliques, it'd be tempered by the idea that they're also part of the staff, and thus also supposed to be neutral. However, the opposite could also be true. If one side is winning too much, who's to say the lord in charge, being one of the organizers, isn't pulling the strings in the background to do so? Even if they're completely innocent, having the players doubt the people who run the game can only foster an environment of distrust. Honestly, the second option is probably the best. The first doesn't really capture the spirit of the game in its entirety, and the third could end with a corrupt staff group, or at least one that's viewed as corrupt regardless of innocence. The second option at least ensures that you have someone above them in power on a meta level, so if there was any real grievances, the players could have someone to go to. It might make for an elitist environment, but other LARPs have lords without the environment being toxic, so there is precedent. As a quick reminder, all LARPs are made up of human beings. Not all LARPs have to be perfect from a game design point of view, and at the end of the day, a LARP is a group activity, and it's up to the people to make them work. The perfect system can still be ruined by the worst players, but the worst system can be saved by the best community. So that's my analysis of Mount and Blade Warband and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the game yourself, and if so, how did it go? Comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come back to the subject sometime in the future. My name is Freebiewitz, and thank you for watching.